Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I almost said good morning because we're so used to the forum very early in the morning during last almost 30 years. But in any case, thank you very much for joining us for this very special luncheon with a very special guest speaker, Jeffrey Schott. Jeffrey Schott happened to be in town, so we forced him to come here to share his valuable insights and wisdom on the most timely subject for discussion nowadays, trade conflicts between U.S. and China and Korea and Japan and so forth. I just hope you enjoy your luncheon and enjoy Jeffrey's talk and share his very valuable insights on this matter. I don't think I'll waste any more time, and I'll have Chairman Chan proceed with this forum. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Sagong. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, my script had good morning. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IGE Forum. To save time, I would like to move very fast here. We are so very delighted to have Mr. Jeffrey Schott, who is the leading authority in the area of trade dispute and economic sanctions. We cannot think of any more timely subject for today's meeting, the ongoing impending trade dispute between the United States and China, and also between Korea and Japan. So Mr. Schott, I think, is indeed uniquely qualified to share with us his exceptional insights and forward-looking views about this most challenging issue we face at this time. Before you invite Mr. Schott to the stage, please allow me to say a few words about his great credentials. He's currently a senior fellow at Pearson Institute for International Economics, specializing in international trade policy and economic sanctions, as I said. He has taught at Princeton University and Georgetown University before, has also served in the U.S. Treasury Department. Since 2003, he has been a member of the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee of the U.S. government, and also a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy. He holds a graduate degree with distinction from Johns Hopkins University. Without further ado, let's welcome Jeff Schott, who will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by Q&As.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jun, Dr. Sagong. The relationship that I have had and my colleagues have had with your institute has been a long and fruitful one, and it's a great honor to be invited back time and time again to join you and to engage in discussions with the very distinguished audience that you always gather. Today you've given me a difficult task and a long title for my talk. U.S.-China, Japan-Korea trade disputes, and the future of the world trading system. I think anyone could have taken one part of that title and spent an hour, but I have 30 minutes, and I will try to integrate ideas and comments on all three. And hopefully put it in a way that inspires some questions about the issues that I've left out. So I'll start with the U.S.-China trade dispute, which actually is a long-standing one, but for the convenience of the talk, we'll start with the dispute since the introduction or the entry into office of President Trump in January 2017. The U.S.-China trade war was initially deemed to be an exercise in rebalancing trade. Concerns about the very large merchandise trade imbalance. Though most economists would tell you that it was not a serious area of concern. But the idea was to propel more Chinese purchases of U.S. goods and to blunt Chinese subsidies and regulatory policies that distorted international trade and investment, particularly in traditional industries. So steel was an immediate focus of the Trump administration. High-tech issues have followed subsequently. Now, what has been interesting and important to keep in mind is that players on both sides thought that the conflict would be short and yield a modest array of Chinese commitments to remove discrimination against U.S. firms. But instead, after 5 or 6 quarters of conflict and volatile swings, which you can call from manic to depressive, almost on the turn of a tweet, you have movement towards an agreement, as we had in April of this year, and then suddenly the deal unravels. And then it is brought back together again. The markets react gleefully, talks resume, and then another snag hits, and you enter into the manic depressive cycle again. That continues today, and now we're on a manic part of the phase, with officials meeting and trying to put the trade negotiations back on track, with the hope that senior level officials will meet in Washington on October 10th and 11th to try to regain momentum for at least a preliminary agreement that will halt this cycle of tariff escalation. It has come at costs. The prolonged fighting has set back prospects for U.S.-China economic cooperation going forward by increasing mistrust between the two sides. And that has had spillover effects on relations with countries in the region, particularly Korea, and it has damaging implications for the World Trade Organization. Let me just mention very briefly where we are in this fight right now. If the threats that have been issued in the past month or two are fulfilled, by December 15th, U.S. penalty tariffs will cover about 97% of imports from China, with an average duty of about 24%. That's compared with an average most favored nation duty of 3% before the start of the trade war. So this was a key promise of President Trump to his supporters during the 2016 campaign, that he would impose tariffs on China's goods, make them more expensive in the U.S. market, and he talked about 35 to 45% during the campaign, but he's essentially fulfilled his promise of raising tariffs almost 25% across the board on Chinese goods if there is the imposition of the threatened tariff increases on October 15th of this year and on December 15th. Almost all Chinese imports will be subject to very high penalty duties from 15 to 30%. Now, China has retaliated in kind, but a little more carefully, because policymakers in Beijing have been cautious about imposing costs on their own companies. And when you tax imports, you can tax local production, and you certainly can tax exports that use imported components. And so China has, or will have by December 15th, imposed penalty tariffs on about 69% of U.S. Exports, leaving out important sectors such as most aircraft and pharmaceuticals and the like, where there aren't easy substitutes or alternative suppliers, and where U.S. goods are needed to maintain the competitiveness of Chinese production. Like the United States, the average trade-weighted tariff will go up to about 25–26% from the most favored nation rate before the start of the tariff war of 8%. So a big price wedge between the access of U.S. goods to the Chinese market compared to the access of other foreign goods to the Chinese market. To further exacerbate that discrimination, or that price discrimination, China has engaged in a reduction of most favored nation tariffs on many goods for everybody else. And so the discrimination against U.S. exporters is actually bigger than the 26%, because the MFN tariff has gone down for other countries, just as the tariff applied to U.S. goods has gone up. In some sectors, this has made a tremendous difference, with a tariff differential of 25% or more, and that has encouraged or propelled significant trade diversion away from U.S. exports. In agriculture and soybeans, for example, but also in other products. The U.S. tariffs have also caused trade diversion away from Chinese exporters, but it hasn't gone back to U.S. production. The main effect of the tariff war and the dislocation of Chinese exports to the United States has been the shifting of goods to other exporters in East and Southeast Asia. So what we've seen so far is basically tariffs China has raised tariffs on U.S. goods and has lowered tariffs on everyone else. As a result of the actions of both the United States and China, the increased protectionism on both sides, U.S.-China trade, exports and imports have gone down. U.S. trade deficit with China has gone down slightly, though a very small dent in a very large bilateral merchandise deficit. Trade diversion has increased, with some U.S. imports sourced out of Southeast Asia instead of China. And the global U.S. trade deficit has been about the same. It's actually slightly higher, less due to the tariff war than to the fact that the U.S. economy has been relatively robust and the dollar has appreciated. And that has led to a very large U.S. merchandise trade deficit. So in that sense, the trade war doesn't seem to have been worth all the damage that's been done so far, with one exception. President Trump made it one of his promises that he would raise tariffs, and he has done that. And he regards this as a key promise upheld to his supporters, who he depends on to maintain their strict loyalty to him in the 2020 presidential election. So there is an economic component, there is a political component, and I think politics, as we get closer and closer to the election next November 2020, politics will dominate economic considerations. That leads me to the concern that even if there is an attempt to reach an agreement, as negotiators are working on a preliminary agreement to at least have a ceasefire in the U.S.-China trade war and in the escalation of the tariffs, even if China adds to that purchases of U.S. goods and makes commitments on foreign investment and intellectual property, which they can do based on laws that they have already promulgated and that will enter into force in January of next year. And they can even elaborate a little bit on the foreign investment issues and the protection of intellectual property in China. That type of an agreement is unlikely to be sustained amid the political pressure from both Republicans and Democrats to challenge China and to say that any deal that Trump made with China has been too soft as part of the political debate leading up to the election. That leads me to think that any deal that could arise, and that hopefully will arise in the coming weeks or months, which would partially roll back some of the tariff increases or prevent the additional tariff increases that are scheduled in the coming 2 months. I significantly doubt that that type of deal can be sustained. And so we'll be back into a period of disruption just as the uncertainty increases in the U.S. political debate next year. So far, the net effect of the increased tariffs has been a small decline in GDP in both the United States and China. Now, you think about it, these are two very large economies. And even though there's $500 billion of imports from the United States, by the United States from China, you raise that cost by 25%, you're still only talking about $125 billion, which for an economy that over $20 trillion, that's still relatively small in macro terms. So that leads some people to say, well, don't worry about it, it's just tariffs. The problem is, it's not just tariffs. And as many businessmen in the room know, what has been the more damaging factor in the tariff war has been the increased uncertainty, the lack of policy predictability that makes it much more difficult to make investment decisions. And that has led some investors to sit on their hands and forego new investments that are needed to promote and propel economic growth. It has led others, by necessity, because of the threat to their supply chains, to engage in relatively less efficient investment, whether it be in redundant or excess inventories or redundant supplier relationships and supply chains in case one supplier is blocked from because of new policy sanctions. This is inefficient. It reduces productivity, and it is built into the system, and it will constrain economic growth over the medium term. So the damage that you're seeing on the investment front is much more serious than the immediate damage that you're seeing on the tariff front. And that applies not only to the United States and China, but to all the other economies affected who do business with them and also suffer from the same uncertainty in global economic prospects. This is, I think, a part of the U.S. strategy that was not well prepared and is damaging to U.S. and Chinese interests. But for the United States, I think it has a more near-term prospect because we're facing an election next year, and the political prospects, while the U.S. economy is weakening, I think will be a factor in the decision on who is elected president next year. Normally, incumbent presidents have a great advantage in being reelected, especially if the economy is doing well. And so President Trump is going to try to do everything he can to keep modest but reasonable economic growth. The employment situation is very good. Interest rates are low. And so if he could keep economic conditions the way they are today, he'd stand a good chance of being reelected. I will abstract from the developments of the last 2 days on that, and I can talk about that later. I'm talking about economics here. But the likelihood is that there will be some softening in economic growth. That's why President Trump is putting so much pressure on the Fed. But there is a very low likelihood that the Fed will accommodate the president's demands, which are for very large additional cuts in interest rates. Now, there's another factor to the U.S.-China trade war that is causing problems, and that is much harder to resolve and will be much more long-standing. And that is the friction on high technology trade and investment. And it is one that goes beyond disputes about Huawei and ZTE. It is rooted in concern about technological competition. It is rooted in concern about the misappropriation of technology through cybersecurity intrusions. And it has led to legislation promulgated in 2018 that severely increases the screening of foreign direct investment in the United States, particularly in high technology sectors. That screening, or the threat of that screening, has already had a profound effect on Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States. It's virtually dried up. The other and overseas investment in the United States, I think, is still maintained, but companies are becoming more cautious, less so because of the threat of screening a la China, and more because of the weakening economy and shifts in consumer preferences in automobiles and other sectors. This also has an effect, though, on outflow from the United States. Along with the increased screening of inward investment into the United States, the Congress passed the Export Control Reform Act, which increases controls on sensitive high technology products and technologies that can be exported and to countries and end up in China. So it doesn't just involve the direct transfers of products to China, but it can involve the interruption or the tougher screening of contracts between the United States and Korea and the United States and Japan, for fear that there would then be a diversion of the technology or the product to China. This is something that could get very severe, depending on how the U.S. government defines, which it is now doing in the context of implementing legislation, implementing regulations for last year's legislation, defining what is a emerging and foundational technology. Now, if you don't know what that means, you're in good company. Neither does the U.S. government, and neither do I. But it's a lot more than what we've been screening so far and controlling so far. And how extensive the definition is will depend on how restrictive U.S. Surveillance is on outflows of high-tech goods and technologies. This is a problem that is complicated. It is generating very strong political reactions in both the United States and China. So it's become more than an economic issue, it's a national security issue, and has led to a sharp reaction, negative reaction in Beijing, just as it's generated strong antagonistic feelings in the U.S. Congress against China. This is something that's not going to be resolved by trade negotiators, and is going to be a part of the landscape of Asia-Pacific economic relations, even if we find a way of accommodating the trade disputes. And then there's the third area of potential increase in U.S.-China relations, and that involves the U.S. economic sanctions against Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, particularly the oil sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. The United States has pursued a policy of trying to squeeze very tightly revenues generated from oil and gas exports from Iran and Venezuela. China is the main oil customer of both those countries. And under the current U.S. sanctions, since May, when waivers had been granted to allow the a transition to phasing out purchases from those countries, since May, any company buying oil or gas, shipping those products, financing those products, whether it's a barter transaction or a debt relief payment, any of those energy companies, shipping companies, financial institutions are liable to very serious U.S. economic sanctions, leading to basically disbarment from markets using U.S. dollars, which means basically you can't do business outside for most of the world economy. Very serious, particularly since in China, one has to suspect strongly, and I am sure U.S. intelligence agencies have the proof, that the main state-owned energy companies, Sinopec and China National Petroleum Company, are involved in those transactions, along with major financial institutions. And if sanctions are imposed against those companies, then the U.S.-China trade dispute is elevated to a different level, very disruptive, and it doesn't make any sense to do that. So far, the administration has been very careful because China is cooperating with U.S. policy on Iran and North Korea to an extent. It's reduced it to an extent. To the extent that it benefits China, they do it. Excuse me. With regard to Iran, China has had to reduce its purchases, but it's used the leverage of the U.S. sanctions to get better prices. And so Iran has to deeply discount the price that it sells oil to China to maintain those flows. And but if the White House decides that it wants to escalate and really cause a dust-up, it can happen. And soon after I wrote a piece about this, there was an announcement from the U.S. Treasury Department that additional ships, Chinese ships, were being sanctioned, and companies being sanctioned this week, just a few days ago, for dealing in Iranian crude. And so I can talk more about that if you like, but there are some potential major areas of disruption that need to be avoided to prevent, as I said in my piece, from throwing oil onto the existing fire of U.S.-China trade disputes. Now, as I feared, I'm spending too much time, and I need to say a few words about the Korea-Japan dispute. Not entirely unrelated, because Japan and Korea are also victims of the U.S.-China trade war and the disruptions to the supply chains. So you would think, if you were a businessman or someone worried about economic growth in Korea, that you wouldn't take steps to further exacerbate the problems that economic forces in your own economy are having to deal with because of the disruption from the U.S.-China. And you would think that there would be a way of accommodating, not accommodating, managing a long-standing political, diplomatic, cultural dispute that with an economic partner who accounts for, albeit less than 10% of total merchandise trade, but importantly concentrated in key sectors of the Korean economy, and Japan as well has a much more dominant position in terms of foreign investment in the Korean economy. Almost $50 billion of investment, accounting for more than 20% of foreign direct investment in Korea. That's divided about half and half between manufacturing and services. But it's still, when you get to $50 billion, it's a significant impact on the economy. Now, I'm not here to preach about the causes of the Korea-Japan dispute. You all know that better than I. I can sympathize with the concerns. My own family suffered during the war terribly in concentration camps, and some were exterminated. But it is up to the political leaders of countries to deal with these long-standing problems and manage their effects so that they minimize the damage to each society. That is not being done, in my view. And there are three governments to blame. Three. Japan and Korea, the dispute is undermining their own national security interests and those of the United States. Economic security is being compromised as well, threatening further damage to supply chains already adversely affected by the U.S.-China trade war. There is no credible economic rationale for discriminating against the traded goods of each other for national security reasons. So there's been a lot of litigation in the WTO. That's fine, but both sides are vulnerable to losing that litigation in the WTO under existing WTO rules. But that's a decision that's going to take months and months, probably years, to resolve, and the current damage is proceeding now. So WTO litigation is not going to factor importantly in the resolution or the management of this problem. Long-standing problems should not impair urgently needed bilateral cooperation in the face of common security threats in the region. And this is critical. So I know there are a lot of factors involved in the policies that have been taken by President Moon and Prime Minister Abe. That's unfortunate. As an American, I can say that's unfortunate and it's counterproductive. But I don't pass judgment on either. But I will pass judgment on my own government. Even worse than the actions taken by U.S. allies is the inaction of the Trump administration, allowing the fracturing of a critical U.S. security alliance is one of the most profound failures of the Trump administration to date. I can't imagine, and I've been in Washington for almost 50 years, I can't imagine another instance where a U.S. president would not be actively engaged in sitting down with key allies and working out a way of managing their differences so that it would not impair our common security interests. And yet, while we have representatives from the State Department here in town, the comments are so milquetoast. This is a critical problem for U.S. security, and it should be recognized as such. And we're not doing enough. So the security issue dominates the economic. But when Korea and Japan are divided and the United States is not engaged, then the ability to manage the economic fallout from the U.S.-China dispute becomes more limited. And it is harder, or it closes off options for cooperation or for efforts that Korea can take to use trade and investment in the region to compensate or offset some of the adverse effects of the U.S.-China trade war. And I don't think that's sufficiently accepted or understood in Seoul, in Tokyo, or in Washington, at least judged by the reactions to date. And I say this as a longtime friend of Korea, as someone who worked very hard 20 years ago to ensure the strengthening of our alliance, economic and security, through the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And I've been a promoter of that and of friendship between our countries. And similarly with Japan. We need to have a security relationship that is so close that there's no light between it. And we have to be careful about anything that risks even moving us apart a little. And I think there's a lot of responsibility in Washington to do more. So that leads me to the last part of my charge this afternoon.
Okay.
And that is, you're wondering how I was going to pull all of these threads together. I'm trying to figure that out myself. What does this mean for the global trading system? Well, so far, it's bad for the trading system, because what the United States is doing to China and what China has retaliated in kind is illegal under the World Trade Organization rules. So basically, that is not helping to establish trust in a forum that could moderate or the dispute or serve as a foundation for resolution. We're not taking sufficient steps to work with our allies to try to find broader regional or multilateral responses to the problems raised by the U.S.-China dispute, because we're attacking the very countries that we need to be working with us, and undercutting the multilateral system, the WTO, that would be the area where we have the opportunity to work with China. This dispute has put the WTO in some jeopardy, and the system of rules-based international trading of the rules-based international trading system in crisis and at risk, because we are undercutting the basis for going back to the negotiating table and updating the international trade rule book. If you think about it, with only a small exception, the World Trade Rule Book was developed in the early 1990s and hasn't been changed since. And world trade has changed dramatically since then. And so the WTO has been notably unsuccessful in updating the rule book. And so we've had to look outside of the WTO to regional agreements, starting, prominently the Chorus FTA was a big upgrade in many areas over WTO rules, and providing precedents for the multilateral trading system if and when negotiations at the multilateral level, at the global level, could proceed. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership adopted most of the Chorus FTA. It was basically modeled after the Chorus FTA to spread those disciplines to major countries in the Asia-Pacific region, based on Chorus and based on American values and American trade and economic practices. And that's what President Trump withdrew from. And since that time, to be perfectly honest, he has spent most of his trade policy efforts trying to undo the damage that he did on day 3 of his administration. The agreement in North America with Canada and Mexico is largely a reiteration of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with some additional auto protection thrown in. The deal that was just announced with Japan reconstructs the agricultural deal with a little less than what the United States would have gotten in the TPP, but without major U.S. concessions in other areas. And so the Chorus FTA, after a lot of disputes, was left virtually intact. Not changes that did not have major commercial significance, but at the payment of steel quotas that cut Korean steel exports to the United States by over a third. So we're seeing this increased protectionism, which goes against what the WTO is supposed to prevent. And the problem is, in the US-China context, that we're dealing with not China not playing by the rules, because largely China is playing by the rules. And when it hasn't, the United States has brought them to the WTO, and we've won almost all of those cases, except a few dealing with anti-dumping practices that are particularly irksome to our Ambassador Lighthizer. But the biggest problem is that China's policies that distort trade and investment are either bending the rules a little or basically circumventing the rules or entering territory where the WTO has ambiguous rules or no rules at all. And that has only underscored the damage that is being done to the world trading system by not having successful multilateral negotiations that constantly upgraded the rule book. And the cost of the failure of the Doha round is now being basically exhibited, demonstrated in many new trade disputes, including the US-China trade war. Now, fixing the WTO requires cooperation and participation by the major trading countries. And this is where I tie everything together. You're not going to get acceptance in the WTO of new international rules unless the US and China cooperate with each other, and unless Korea and Japan, other major trading nations, are a part of the process of developing those rules. So having the US and China increasing their mistrust of each other, and having Japan and Korea increasing their mistrust of each other, only makes it more and more difficult to move forward at the regional or multilateral level. Updating the rule book will require changing policies or current national positions in key areas, many in China, some of which would need to be done sooner rather than later, but some that could be phased in over time. But it also will require changes in what the U.S. has been doing, particularly since the advent of the Trump administration, with regard to anti-dumping and countervailing duties, some changes in domestic U.S. law which are dealing with currency manipulation and basically adding provisions to U.S. countervailing duty law that will be violations of the WTO. That's getting pretty deep in the weeds, but essentially the concern about currency manipulation is going to lead to more U.S. distortions through the use of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And of course, most prominently, the abuse of national security provisions, which the U.S. has done to an increasing extent and threatens to do in the auto sector. This does not cast a optimistic forecast for moving forward in the WTO, and it does not provide a good means for the current administration to move forward, because they've shown very little interest in using the WTO to promote their negotiating objectives, relying almost primarily on bilateral negotiations. I think if President Trump is reelected, we will have a serious crisis in the world trading system, because the trading rules can't really withstand more abuse and lack of enforcement, and there will be more and more pressure in the United States and other countries to act unilaterally, follow the example of the Trump administration, and that will lead to a fracturing of the trading rules. I think if a Democrat is elected, there will still be major challenges because the Democrats are as critical of China as President Trump, and will be even more critical of Chinese practices with regard to human rights, which will have an even stronger reaction in Beijing than some of the initiatives of the Trump administration. But the Democrats probably would be more open to working closely with Korea and Japan if there was a workable process to try to find regional and multilateral solutions and to strengthen international economic institutions. And I think that is my sole ray of optimism going forward. And what this means for Korea is to reevaluate the options you have for international economic relations, particularly in the region. What needs to be done, with whom, how to work out agreements that will increase policy predictability and help promote the more efficient use of economic resources, inflow of investment in technology to strengthen the Korean economy. That's something that requires some planning, both in terms of domestic economic reform and in terms of working with trading partners to ensure open access and opportunities for export and investment in major trading partners, China, Japan, and elsewhere. I've said it on this platform many times before, but a reevaluation of the CPTPP would be in order at that stage, including pushing the United States and China to work towards building a bridge using that Asia-Pacific initiative. That's about as optimistic as I can get, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for running over on my time, but I got carried away on the Korea-Japan issue, but I spoke sincerely and personally on that, and in the spirit of trying to help friends find a way of making things better for their own economy and their own society. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your very illuminating speech this afternoon. Although time is running a little late, I would like to open the floor for questions directed to Mr. Schott. You could do it while you were sitting.
Yeah. I actually can see more people this way.
Okay. Yeah. Daniel.
Thanks, Jeff, once again. Daniel Shin. Just a quick question. So now, as you point out, WTO getting weaker as U.S. really ditches the scene, and then also, in a way, Korea-Japan situation also, we try to leverage WTO, but it seems to be, fairly dysfunctional in a way. But to the extent that America still can mediate between two countries to probably have a better conversation, I think we are hopeful on that. But then, when there is a really growing tension between China and the U.S., and then there is no sort of a more bigger omnipotent governing bodies out there, do you think that there is another chance that we might see another rise of new version of the WTO, or maybe like a AIIB, maybe not the best comparison, but then, what China did for the AIIB, for IMF, do you think a totally new organization led by Chinese regime, do you think there will be a chance?
I don't think so. What you can see is an evolving Plan B. And a few years ago, that was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as a way of moving forward with upgrading the rules so that it could be then transported back to Geneva to a broader multilateral. That was always difficult, but it was easier when the United States was in it. With the U.S. leaving, it actually has created an interesting dynamic, because other countries need to have that platform maintained, and so Japan and Australia and New Zealand have kept the updated rule book in place and are implementing it. Canada and Mexico are doing it as well. And it's the type of rules that you want to at least have as the basis for dealing with the problems between the United States and China. But it means getting the United States and China back to engaging with each other, and maybe even over time, in the next decade, modifying the TPP so that it can accommodate the participation of those countries. And the European Union, with trade ties with many of the countries, many of the TPP countries, would be an additional participant. But once you do that, you've basically have most of the world's GDP at the table. And then you can find the basis for bringing it back to Geneva so that it can apply for all countries and deal with the particular adjustment or problems of the poorer countries. That's grasping at straws, perhaps, but it does require a more positive view towards the regional plan B than Korea has been willing to consider to date.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kim, you wanted to raise a question?
Thank you, Jeff. I'd like to continue on the question of the global trade regime. WTO has been effective or ineffective last half a century, but Trump very much against it and apparently declining to appoint a seat that the appeals panel or whatever. And I don't think even if Democrats to replace him with the two socialists as a front runner in the Democratic Party, I don't know how sanguine they are to maintain this system. And so I'd like to ask you opinion of the future regime of the WTO, and if U.S. does not actively participate, can there be an effective global trade panel? And I'd like to add one more question to that is, ever since David Ricardo, international trade third editions always believed in free trades. Nobody questioned it because both parties benefit out of it. But one question that the economists did not address is how is that benefit shared?
Right.
Now that did not matter so long as it was like the U.S. and the Korea or U.S. and the Malaysia, etc. But when it becomes the U.S. and the China, this becomes a very, very serious problem. And then added, furthermore, one thing that the international economy did not address is they looked at as an economic issue, but related impact of geopolitical hegemonical relationship. Now you enter these two questions. Trump, although it looks very, very insane to a lot of intellects, a lot of rank and file Americans do support his attitude. So how do you address that? Thank you.
I think you've put both those questions very precisely and very correctly. And so I will give you very clear responses. On dispute settlement, very necessary to have an effective system of dispute settlement in the WTO. Otherwise, you can't guarantee the enforcement of the rules, and no one will negotiate new rules. Why negotiate new rules if you can't enforce? So, the United States has not dropped out of the dispute settlement system. It just wants to kill, or not kill, it wants to avoid the appellate process for cases that go against the United States. So essentially, the situation that will evolve in December of this year is exactly what Ambassador Lighthizer wants. He wants an effective panel decision process, and if the ruling favors the United States, great, we applaud it. If the ruling goes against the United States, we appeal. But since there is no one to hear the appeal, or you can't construct a panel, then under WTO rules, the initial ruling cannot be implemented. It goes into judicial limbo until the appellate process is complete. So essentially, the ruling against the United States is blocked. How I describe it is like you're flipping a coin. Heads I win, tails you lose. That's the perfect scenario for Ambassador Lighthizer. It means that the United States is basically not held accountable when it's in violation. Everyone else is under the dispute settlement process, and other countries are working out surrogate appellate procedures that would apply to disputes among themselves, but not when they are in dispute with the United States. So that's not going to be a sustainable situation. I think that you can get a change in the U.S. position, but countries will have to pay for it in typical trade negotiating fashion by making concessions in other areas to what the United States wants. And maybe it's on digital trade, maybe it's on other substantive areas. That depends. But right now, negotiating in the WTO is not a priority for Ambassador Lighthizer. Your second point is also very perceptive. Part of the problem of sustaining support for the WTO is complaints about the inequitable sharing of benefits, both between countries, rich and poor, and among countries, which is the responsibility of each government on how it adjusts its tax and expenditure policies to distribute the gains from trade. Many countries, including my own, do a terrible job at that. And so there's built up resistance, actually, in both the Democrats and the Republicans to the existing system of trading rules, both either on social equity grounds or on sovereignty grounds. There is a way of beginning to change that debate, and I think you heard some resonance of it in the past week, mostly from very young people, many who were not old enough to vote, who are talking about climate change. That's an issue that is not being considered at all by the Trump administration. I chair the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee to USTR, and while they are doing a good job on environment chapters in their trade agreements, they have, as the Obama administration did as well, they have dropped the ball on climate change. And if a Democrat is elected, that will be one of the priority areas of concern. And so developing a system that promotes a green economy through various trade rules could be a way of reviving broader-based support for international trade negotiations. But it would have to have a different payoff to different segments of of society. And the Green Deal, I think, brings in the younger generations that would see renewed interest and opportunity in working with the trading system. This is something that requires a lot of careful work There have been some studies and proposals put forward by Senator Warren and others that are essentially have good objectives, but are fatally flawed in their detail, talking about border carbon adjustment taxes and other types of policies that would be difficult to implement. But the green area, promoting renewables, promoting investment in infrastructure to support the expansion of renewable energy resources, providing exemptions, short-term or permanent, for subsidies to promote that type of development in societies, as existed in the WTO in its first 5 years. Those are all things that deserve a lot more attention. And if there's, in my view, if there's any hope for the WTO in the next decade, it will be through this reorientation of the WTO agenda and working in that way. And I hope so, because this is one of the last gasps of optimism that I have for the trading system.
Thanks, Jeff. Given the time constraint, perhaps this is the last question from Professor An. You wanted to raise a question.
Actually, Jeff, this morning I wanted to explore this issue a little bit further, but no time. Yesterday, President Trump and Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, they congratulated each other to reach a U.S.-Japan trade deal. We are not calling it as a free trade, but nevertheless, when I look at it, and Japan opened up its beef sector and agricultural product, and also U.S. lowered the tariff rate, the auto part, so on and so on. So then I thought if Japan and U.S. expand the territorial, the sectoral coverage, including service, sector, so on, that is nothing but the U.S.-Japan free trade, which will open the entry to, scrapped TPP, the 11. So once that happens, maybe, the Korea should join the current, the TPP 11, together with the United States. And but given the ongoing conflict between Korea and Japan, maybe, I don't know, Japan would be willing to accept Korea's attempt to enter, expanded TPP, going back to original, status. What is your view on this?
Well, the agreement that was announced this week is really a mini deal, and it is intended to be the first stage of a two-stage process. Basically, the first stage is increasing agricultural access to levels comparable to those existing for current TPP members. Not preferences, but basically leveling the playing field. In return for some relatively minor tariff cuts by the United States that can be done under existing tariff cutting authority, so that you don't have to go to Congress to get approval. Some of the tariffs can be eliminated if they're under 5%. Some of the tariffs can be cut by 50% if they're over 5%. But no sensitive products, I believe, are included, and automobiles are not included. So this is really just a down payment on a real free trade agreement that would be negotiated only starting in the spring of next year. And if that could be concluded, essentially one would expect a deal very comparable to what was in the TPP. So, but as Ambassador Lighthizer said this week to the press, he said, we want something comparable to what we got in the TPP, but we want to pay less. And So what they've achieved so far, from what I can see, is they've gotten something a bit less than the TPP, and they've paid a bit less than they paid in the TPP. But was it worth all of the aggravation and the loss market share and the first mover advantages that Europe and Australia and other countries have in the Japanese market compared to U.S. Exporters? Probably not. Does it mean that the U.S. suddenly recoups its market share? Absolutely not. As anyone knows who in business, once you give up a market, you don't automatically get it back. You have to work to get it back, and it's going to take some time to do that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff, for your excellent speech and very productive Q&A session afterwards. Please join me in thanking Jeff for his great efforts this afternoon. Thank you very much.